Hey there, curious friend. I'm Courtney, a certified peer support specialist, and welcome to Wonderland Unlocked. In this series, Curious Connections, we're diving into the twists and turns of friendships and relationships, exploring trust, growth, and those unexpected moments in between. Because in the world of connections, nothing is ever quite as it seems, but it's always worth unlocking together.
Alice, sweetheart, it's nice to see you. Alice. Alice.
Hello and welcome back to Wonderland Unlocked. I'm thrilled to go down the rabbit hole into another episode with you today. This episode, titled The Queen of Hearts, Boundaries, and Ultimatums in Friendships, is going to explore the delicate and often complicated dynamics of setting boundaries and delivering ultimatums in our most meaningful relationships, particularly friendships. Now, if you're familiar with Alice in Wonderland, you know the Queen of Hearts is an iconic figure. She's known for her explosive temper, her rigid expectations, and the infamous "off with their heads" command. While she may seem like an extreme, almost iron-fisted figure, there's something that we can learn from her about boundaries. Boundaries, like the Queen's demands, can be absolute and non-negotiable, but while the Queen's rules are often overbearing, the principles behind them offer us a starting point to reflect on how we set our boundaries in relationships. And ultimatums, as harsh as they can sometimes seem, are not always about being rigid. Sometimes they are necessary to preserve our emotional well-being and self-respect. Today's episode is going to go down the rabbit hole into both boundaries and ultimatums. I'll be sharing personal stories from my own life about how I've navigated these challenging waters in relationships. And I'll also be reflecting on what it means to strike a balance between assertiveness and compassion. I'll examine when boundaries are necessary and when ultimatums might cross the line into something more destructive. So let's take a moment to settle in, take a deep breath, and journey into the world of the Queen of Hearts, where we'll explore how we can establish firm but healthy boundaries in our own lives. Let's start by discussing the Queen of Hearts herself. When we first meet her in Alice in Wonderland, she's an absolute force of nature. She's imperious, demanding, and expects everyone to follow her rules without question. Her famous decree of "off with their heads" is a perfect example of someone who doesn't tolerate disobedience, and she maintains strict boundaries around her expectations. Now, I'm sure many of us can relate to the need for firm boundaries in our own lives, especially when it comes to friendships. Boundaries are not just about saying no, they are about protecting our own emotional and mental health and ensuring we're not overextended or taken advantage of. But here's the challenge. There's a fine line between asserting healthy boundaries and becoming rigid or even arbitrary, like the Queen. Personally, I found that one of the hardest aspects of setting boundaries in friendships is the fear of being perceived as harsh or unkind. When I was younger, I have often found myself bending over backwards to avoid conflict, saying yes when I wanted to say no, or agreeing to things I wasn't comfortable with. And while I might have avoided the immediate discomfort of saying no, I was ultimately eroding my own sense of self-respect, and my friendships too. In many ways, the Queen's unwavering stance is a reflection of how we might feel when we're not clear about our own boundaries. We're either overcautious, trying to please everyone, or we're on the other side of the spectrum, demanding things from others in an extreme way. And neither approach is sustainable. What the Queen shows us, though, is that boundaries can be non-negotiable, but they don't have to come off at the cost of empathy or fairness. One of the key lessons I've learned about boundaries is that they are about self-respect. They aren't about controlling others or being inflexible. They are about communicating what is acceptable and what isn't in a way that protects my emotional well-being, without shutting others out completely. Think about it. The Queen demands respect, but doesn't always earn it through understanding or compassion. She's more concerned with control than connection. In my own life, I've learned that boundaries work best when they come from a place of clarity and self-awareness, not from a place of fear or aggression. And the key is communication, explaining why certain boundaries are important to me and ensuring that they are upheld without demanding unreasonable things from others. Now that we've looked at the Queen's approach to boundaries, let's talk about the difference between healthy boundaries and rigid, overbearing ones. The Queen of Hearts exemplifies rigid boundaries. She has an all-or-nothing attitude with no room for negotiation or understanding. She's quick to judge, and her way of enforcing boundaries is more about power than protection. When we think about boundaries in our friendships, it's important to understand that boundaries are not about control. They are about creating space for both ourselves and others to exist authentically. Healthy boundaries involve mutual respect. They don't require harsh ultimatums or sweeping demands. Instead, they are grounded in compassion, self-awareness, and a willingness to communicate openly. In my own friendships, I've had to learn the importance of this balance. There have been many times where I've set boundaries that were too rigid, expecting things from my friends that they couldn't give, or worse, not giving them the chance to communicate their own boundaries. I was so caught up in my own needs that I didn't realize that boundaries are a two-way street. And while it's important to enforce our own boundaries, it's equally important to respect the boundaries of others. I remember one particular friendship where I tried to protect myself by creating a boundary around my emotional space. At the time, I thought I was doing the right thing by distancing myself when I felt overwhelmed. However, in doing so, I inadvertently shut my friend out without giving them the opportunity to understand where I was coming from. I didn't consider their emotional needs or the possibility that they, too, might be struggling. In hindsight, I realized that my rigid boundary was more about avoiding discomfort than actually protecting my mental health. It took me a while to understand that emotional connection requires vulnerability, and sometimes that means letting our guard down, even when it feels risky. And then there's the other side of the equation, being on the receiving end of someone else's rigid boundaries. I've had experiences where a friend set such strict, non-negotiable boundaries that it felt like they were shutting me out completely. It wasn't just about protecting their own space. It felt like a wall that I couldn't breach, no matter how hard I cared. I remember a time when I had done something unintentionally hurtful, and instead of a conversation about how we could move forward, the person withdrew completely. They set a boundary that was so rigid that it became impossible to address the issue at hand. It felt like they were avoiding the situation, not protecting themselves. This situation taught me an important lesson. Boundaries, when too rigid, can actually prevent growth in relationships. They can create distance and, over time, foster resentment. It's easy to fall into the trap of using boundaries as a shield, protecting ourselves from vulnerability or conflict rather than using them as tools for mutual respect and understanding. This is where the difference between healthy and rigid boundaries becomes most important. Healthy boundaries are flexible. They allow space for dialogue, compromise, and emotional connection. Rigid boundaries, on the other hand, can create emotional isolation where both people feel misunderstood or unimportant. The key takeaway here is that boundaries need to be flexible, allowing for both mutual respect and understanding. It's not about having the power to control others, but about creating space for honesty and openness. Healthy boundaries invite conversations about needs and desires, while rigid ones shut those conversations down. I've also come to understand that boundaries are not static. They evolve. Sometimes what I needed in a friendship a year ago might not be what I needed now. Our needs change as we grow, and that's okay. What's important is being able to communicate those shifts clearly, without fear of judgment or rejection. In my own friendships, I've learned to ask myself, is this boundary about protecting my well-being, or is it a reaction to fear or past hurt? If it's the latter, it's time to reassess whether the boundary is still serving me or if it's keeping me stuck. Let me share another example. There's a friend in my life who has been incredibly understanding of my emotional ups and downs. There have been times when I've set boundaries with her because I needed space, and she's respected that. But there was one time when my boundary came from a place of insecurity and fear rather than self-care. I had convinced myself that I needed to push her away in order to protect myself from potential hurt. She, however, didn't take it personally. Instead, she patiently waited for me to realize that my boundary was more about fear than genuine need. And when I finally came back to her, we were able to have a conversation about it. In that moment, I learned the power of a flexible boundary, one that allows for reconnection after a temporary distance. This experience reinforced the idea that boundaries are not about drawing hard lines in the sand. They are about creating a space where both people can show up authentically and be heard. We all have different needs at different times, and those needs should be respected. But that doesn't mean we can't bend when it makes sense to do so. The goal is to create an environment where both people feel safe, valued, and understood, where both sides of the boundary equation are respected. The relationship becomes stronger and more resilient. So, as we reflect on this, I want you to think about your own relationships. Are your boundaries flexible or are they rigid? Do you feel safe enough to communicate your needs, and are you able to listen to the needs of others without judgment? Boundaries are a practice, not a set rule. And with practice, we can learn to navigate the delicate balance between protecting ourselves and staying open to others. Now, let's talk about ultimatums. The Queen of Hearts is no stranger to ultimatums. In fact, her entire approach to conflict resolution is based on issuing harsh, immediate decisions that leave no room for discussion.
Off with their heads! Off with his head! Off with his head! If I lose my temper, you lose your head. Understand? Someone's hit the roll for this. Here! Off with him! Off with him! Off with her head! Off with her head!
It's final, extreme, and leaves no space for negotiation or understanding. But when do boundaries transform into ultimatums in our own friendships? When do the lines between healthy limits and rigid demands blur? Ultimatums come into play when we stop offering room for growth, understanding, or compromise in relationships, and instead put the other person in a position where they must choose, change, or lose the relationship. In my own life, I've had moments where I've issued ultimatums in my friendships, not out of malice, but from a place of frustration or feeling like my needs weren't being met. I found myself saying, if you don't do this, I can't continue this friendship. But here's the thing. Ultimatums rarely lead to the resolution we hope for. They often create resentment, push people away, and make the other person feel cornered, which can lead to the end of the relationship altogether. Ultimatums may seem like an easy solution when we're feeling unheard or disrespected, but they often ignore the complexities of the situation and don't allow for the growth that's necessary for a healthy relationship. Friendships, like all relationships, require room for mistakes, for learning, and for evolution. Ultimatums, by their very nature, can hinder that growth. But there are times when ultimatums can be necessary, especially when our boundaries have been ignored, time and time again. For example, a friend repeatedly disrespects your boundaries. It might be necessary to set a more direct, firm stance. Ultimatums, when used carefully and thoughtfully, can sometimes serve as a final effort to assert what is non-negotiable. I have learned that it's important to differentiate between an ultimatum born of frustration and one that's grounded in self-respect and clarity. When an ultimatum is issued out of love and self-awareness, it has a different energy than one that comes from a place of anger or manipulation. In navigating boundaries and ultimatums in friendships, the real challenge lies in balancing compassion with firmness. As we've seen with the Queen of Hearts, it's easy to be firm and unwavering, But the key to lasting, healthy relationships is to temper that firmness with kindness and empathy. This balance is something that I've had to work on constantly in my own friendships. There have been times when I have set boundaries out of fear, and times when I've set boundaries out of love. The most effective boundaries are ones rooted in understanding of both yourself and the other person's perspective. Think about it. The Queen of Hearts might command, "Off with their heads." But what if she asks, "Why did you cross this line? What is it that's important to you, and how can we find a way to make this work?" A softer approach may not have the same dramatic effect, but it opens the door for communication and growth. Ultimately, we need to find that sweet spot where we're protecting our own emotional health while still nurturing the relationships we care about. Boundaries are necessary, but they don't have to come at the expense of connection. And ultimatums should be the last resort, a final call when all other options have been exhausted. As we come to the end of this episode, let's take a moment to reflect on what we can learn from the Queen of Hearts and how we can apply these lessons to our own friendships. Boundaries are essential for maintaining healthy relationships, but they require self-awareness, compassion, and communication. We don't need to be rigid or authoritarian like the Queen, but we can still be firm in what we need and what we won't tolerate. It's important to establish boundaries early on and to communicate them clearly, but it's equally important to remain open to the needs of others and to be willing to compromise when necessary. Ultimatums should be used sparingly only when all other options have been exhausted. Instead of issuing a final demand, we can strive for understanding and dialogue, always prioritizing connection over control. The Queen of Hearts may have an extreme example, but she can still teach us a valuable lesson about the importance of knowing our limits and being unapologetic in maintaining them. Thank you for joining me in this exploration of boundaries and ultimatums in friendships. I hope that you've gained some insights into how you can set healthy boundaries that protect your emotional well-being while still nurturing the connections you value. Remember, just like the Queen of Hearts, you have the power to define your own limits, but with compassion and understanding. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other, and remember, you are the ruler of your own heart.